blue go live button just turned blue, and so I'm hitting it. And we're live. It is Friday, December 3rd, 2021, 5:03 p.m. Eastern Time, and we are not allowed to have fun anymore. But we are allowed to have Noah Hoffman, two-time Olympian in cross-country skiing and anti-doping advocate, and a student at my alma mater, Brown University, on the show to talk to us today. And so it's really nice to see you, friend. It is really great to see you. I was so happy when you went to Brown. And so I'm glad to see that you're happy there and doing well. So I'm excited to catch up a little.
It's so great to be here. And yeah, you and Oakley Olson are the reason that I am here at Brown. So I feel like I owe so much to you.
Yeah. I remember that night that we sat down and I was like, oh no, there's a resumed undergraduate program at Brown, but I don't even know if you'd qualify for that because you never started. So I guess kind of tell us about how you became, how you found out that you had an aptitude for cross-country skiing, and then kind of how you picked the sport and went into it.
Yeah, so growing up in a mountain town in Colorado, everybody skis. I grew up in Aspen. And I was a very focused kid. In fifth grade, I would run laps around the track during recess because I couldn't tell you why I did that, but while everyone else was playing on the playground, that's what I was doing. And
this checks out, by the way. This is completely in keeping with your incredibly earnest personality that you would be fun. That doesn't sound like something I should be having. I'm going to go run laps.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's funny. I have a 2-year-old nephew now who is exhibiting a little bit of the same tendency that I have to kind of look at the world in a very orderly way. So as part of that, for me, I didn't really care what sport I got into. I just wanted to be the best in the world at something. And cross-country skiing was a pretty easy path in Aspen because for two reasons. One is we had just had a former Olympian move back into the Valley and take over the head coaching job when I was getting serious around 9th grade. The second reason is that cross-country skiing is one of those sports that rewards you almost 1-to-1 with how much effort you put into it. And I was willing to put in a whole lot of effort. And so I was getting, immediate rewards. And the harder I trained, the better I did.
Explain that. What is the distinction you're making? What are sports that don't reward you for effort commensurately with the degree of effort?
Almost every other sport, I would say.
So how is it different?
In that it is. So I should say that there's a threshold of you have to have a certain aptitude for endurance sports. You have to have a certain body type. But once you hit that threshold, because it is basically your success is entirely based on your aerobic capacity. And your aerobic capacity is one of those things that you can train. And the harder you train, as long as you don't overtrain yourself, the better you're going to get. And I also was lucky to have a huge tolerance for really high training loads. It wasn't until the last 2 years of my career that I found my limit and absolutely destroyed myself. But I had to find that limit, and it took me 15 years to do it. And I had a great career in the meantime. So to answer your question, Ben, figure skating would be the furthest you could possibly get in Winter Olympic sports from one that is giving you success and commensurate to how much
you're muted.
Yeah, but so that's what I'm having trouble with. I look at a figure skater, and I did a little bit of figure skating at one point. I look at a figure skater and say, these are extreme technical skills. The only way to get them is to train extremely hard. People aren't born knowing how to find edges. They're so granted, it is not a simple matter of cardiovascular load capacity, but it is a pretty simple function of the development of certain technical skills. I can understand basketball, where there's okay, if you're not 7 feet tall, you're at a disadvantage relative to the person who is 7 feet tall. But I guess I'm not sure I understand why figure skating is a counterexample that in your mind to what you're describing. It just seems like a training to a different thing.
Maybe.
So I think the distinction is what I'm talking about is being able to put in work without very good or very much direction. I was, speaking of doping, which we'll talk about a lot later, I was a huge fan of Lance Armstrong. I would watch the Tour de France in the late 90s, early 2000s. And I would go out
and I was convinced he was clean. And I've never recovered from being duped by that motherfucker.
Okay, sorry. We swear sometimes in the show, Noah.
Fair enough. And I actually would say I haven't either, and that has driven my post-skiing career to a large extent. But to get back to my point, so I would go out and emulate. I would go out on 120-mile long road bike rides by myself in 9th grade. Because that's what I saw the Tour de France doing. And you know what? It made me a hell of a lot faster in road biking, running, and skiing, which are my 3 sports. Had I been a figure skater and I watched, even if I was watching tons and tons of elite figure skating, yes, I would have gotten better with ice time, but without direction, without good coaching, I would not have made the type of improvements and a 1-to-1 ratio that I did in endurance sports. That's what
that is like such an interesting, that is like, I think do you think that, well, we can get into this later, but I think that I get what you're saying now. So did you have, I mean, it also seems like, I mean, you were in Aspen. It wasn't like you were wanting for people to coach you in the technique of cross-country skiing. So what you said is you were like talking about like 120-mile bike rides in 9th grade sounds insane, but you picked, how did you pick cross-country skiing? Was it kind of the least amount of competition, your best performance, or?
No, I've thought a lot about this in kind of relation to how sports, can be governed in this country. I didn't actually choose until like junior or senior year of high school. I was not sure whether it was going to be road cycling, running, or cross country skiing, because they all have that same feature of the same skill set. I was getting better at all of them. I won state championships in cross country running. I was winning races in road biking. I was obviously improving as a cross country skier, but it was the governance format of cross-country skiing that was very, very black and white. There's a progression level where you ski well in the local races, and then you get to go to the statewide races. You ski well the statewide races, you get to go to the national races. You ski well the national races, you get to go to your first international races. And you ski well the international races, you get to make the World Cup and then the World Championships, the Olympics. It's like a straightforward path from being a 10-year-old dreaming of this stuff straight to the Olympic Games. In road cycling, you have to get noticed by teams. You got to get picked up. You got to know people. In running,
so it felt like the most meritocratic in some way. Like it just kind of was like, it was like you didn't need coaching. You didn't need to be plugged into sponsors. You didn't need to be plugged into like some type of infrastructure. You could just, as an individual, go out there and compete. And if you did well, then you went to the next level.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that it now that you put it that way, it's like a lot like my mentality in training, which was to bang my head against the wall and voila, I saw results. You do that in cross-country skiing. In running or in road biking, you have to know people. You've got to build relationships, especially road biking. You got to spend years as a domestique before you can be the team leader and going for your own results. That's not true in cross-country skiing. You can just go try to win.
It's super interesting. I mean, it's funny too, because I feel like cross-country skiing is not one of the most, maybe it's because it's a hard sport to watch over time. Like, right. Because like, it's hard to follow people around the track. It's like depending, just generally it's like difficult logistically. But even putting that aside, like it does seem like it was seeming like a pretty, in some ways, even though it's typically Scandinavian, it seems like a pretty, that type of ascension seems very American in a certain way.
Yeah, and it probably is an easier ascension to make in this country. At least it was when I was young, because we weren't that good internationally, and so if you had the results domestically, you'd get the start spots internationally. Whereas if you're in Norway, you really need to be one of the top 15 skiers in the world if you're even going to get a start spot in most of the international competitions. And so like, I think it would have been harder to break through onto that elite level had I been in a place where skiing is really big.
So how do you end up making the Olympic team? Like and how old were you when you made the Olympic team?
I was 24 in Sochi and 28 in Pyeongchang. So by the time I was close-ish, I had an outside shot at making the team in Vancouver in 2010, but I would have needed some really good results. By the time Sochi came around, I was the best distance skier in the country. And I was not focused on making the team. I was focused on going there to win medals, which I did not do, not even close, but that was still my goal. And so it was not about making the team. It was, but I mean, to answer your question on a technical standpoint, certain people qualify based on their like consistent results over the 2 years prior to the games, which is how I qualified. Actually, that's how I qualified in Sochi. I qualified in Pyeongchang, the second route, which is when they don't fill the team. I was skiing much slower in 2018 than I was in 2014. When they don't fill the team based on the people who are skiing well consistently, then they have a national championships, and the top skiers from national championships qualify. That's how I qualified in Pyeongchang.
Cool. Ben, go ahead.
So I'm interested in the psychology of a sport that is high profile in some parts of the world, but low profile here. I think the classic example is, luge or skeleton or something, right? Where, what do we have? 5 tracks in the entire country. And the number of people who, to do it here, you have to be somehow captivated by something that is much more popular elsewhere than it is here.
I just like, do you know Lauren? Have you ever heard of Lauren Gibbs, Noah, by any chance? She was in my class at Brown, and she was just like a badass track and field person, but never did that much with it. And she just stayed in shape and did CrossFit and did a bunch of stuff. And she was recruited to Ben's point. Sorry to interrupt, Ben, but she was recruited to Ben's point. Like, I don't know, we were like 10 years out of college, like to do bobsled for like the women's bobsled team for like the US. And she I mean, I think they did pretty well. I don't remember what happened, but anyways, it just reminds me of like kind of this story. Like, it was like all of a sudden on Facebook, she was on the Olympic team, having never done bobsled before in her entire life. Like, it was just amazing.
So I'm just interested in the Winter Olympics is kind of full of these sports, but there are some of them in the Summer Olympics as well. What is the sort of domestic profile of a cross-country ski racer in the United States? Is it?
It might be regional based on whether he's in Colorado or like Vermont or like New Hampshire or versus everywhere else in the country.
Sure, but I mean, it's a very strange thing to have this field that is in which you're nationally competitive, that you go to, one of the biggest sports events in the world, that a lot of people watch, and yet, generally speaking, people really have only a dim awareness that the competitive field exists other than that.
Yeah, it is a little bit like living in two worlds, I think. And so you see it like in Aspen, there's actually 2 daily papers in Aspen, and I was in the paper all the time because they write about their athletes. Aspen sent, it's a tiny town, but we sent 12 or 13 athletes to Sochi. It was like a huge contingent of the Olympic team was from Aspen. So in Aspen, you're like, you feel like you're
because genetically, like people, do you think that there's just like more people who are athletes and have children and like live in Aspen? Like,
definitely not genetically. It's got to do with the money, and it's got to do with
that's true.
The quality of people, the type of people, very expensive. So for one, these sports are expensive, especially alpine skiing. And then for 2, you have to, there's not that many places in the country to do these sports. You have, like Ben said, there's not a sliding track in Aspen, but there is great cross-country ski trails, and there's great alpine mountains, and there's an incredible terrain park. The X Games are held there, so you get lots of free skiers and snowboarders coming out of Aspen. So it's access. It is lifestyle. There's a very active lifestyle. So we had ski days during high school, and like out of my 120 person class, there were like 5 people who would choose like the indoor option during the ski day. Everybody else skied. So everybody's, we had a chairlift from our public high school onto the mountain. So like senior year of high school, I had first 2 periods off. I would come to the class, come to school at 7 a.m. or 6 a.m. and lift weights because the cross-country ski or the ski club was right across the parking lot. So I'd lift weights, change into my snow pants, take the lift up, ski all morning, come down, go to 2 classes in my snow pants, go back across to the clubhouse, train for 2 hours, and ride my bike home at 5 p.m. That was my lifestyle. And my parents didn't have to be involved at all. The school was free. The ski club was subsidized. We lived in employee housing. It was just absolutely, the type of place for your kids to grow up, for me to grow up, that you just can't even dream of.
Yeah, that's completely
that's
insane.
why you end up with 12 Olympians.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay.
So I want to ask about a different kind of skiing before we move on to doping. We recently had my uncle on the show, who is a somewhat famed backwoods skier in very remote rural Montana. And I'm curious about, backwoods skiing is kind of a hybrid of downhill or alpine and cross country skiing. I'm curious about what the crossover is among cross country ski racing people with this kind of, scary, crazy backwoods skiing culture.
All I do these days is backcountry ski. I have actually
Really?
cross-country skied in 2 years.
Whoa. Really, Noah? Because I remember you retiring, and I was like, this is like, you can't, I remember like laughing to myself when you said retire. I'm like, you have to come up with a better word for it than that, even though it made sense and I got it. Like, it was like, I was like, you're just so young, like to be walking around saying you're retired. But there's, wait, you like went on a 3-hour cross-country ski the day you retired, I think. What are you doing? So wait, you're doing backcountry? Does that mean that you're doing like heli skiing? Are you like doing skins? Like, how are you like, is it telly? Like, what are you doing?
No, I mean, just for fun. This is like the type of skiing that I always wanted to do during my career. Is to go like alpine skiing on big terrain in the mountains. I could never do it. I spent 15 years traveling to some of the greatest ski venues in the world, alpine ski areas, incredible, mountains all over Europe and Asia, and never got to explore.
Wait, before you go on, we're getting some requests in the chat to define terms. Backcountry skiing is generally, and Noah, correct me to the extent that I get this wrong, it is done on basically an alpine ski with a loose heel, and you lay skins on the surface of the ski so that you can go forward but not backward. You climb mountains on skis and then ski down them. Is that a fair account?
Yeah, that's essentially correct. Although when you ski down, you lock your heel down. So when you ski down, you're just alpine skiing. What you think of when you take a chairlift up, this is just a different way to get up the mountain, a much cheaper way, as it may be. Also much more dangerous because it's not avalanche controlled. So people die in the backcountry all the time in avalanches.
Yeah, we were talking about that with his uncle and like John, obviously. Like John used to go.
John was almost killed by an avalanche, and his wife was killed by an avalanche.
Sorry, that's John is his uncle, not my John, who you know.
No, like, my uncle.
John. My John used to go in March to Washington State and to like a bunch of mountains up there and do backcountry skiing. And the Marchness of it always made me really nervous. It was like cheaper for all of them to go skiing and get like a big lodge and like kind of do the skiing, but like it made me like you'll understand like the sun at that time of year like changes how the snow acts, and it like used to make me so nervous, and I would make him call me from the landline in the cabin like every day when they finished skiing, so because I was so nervous about it. But like I didn't know that that's what you've been doing. So where have you gone? Like what kind of stuff have you gone? Have you gone back to some of the places that you used to cross country ski?
No, unfortunately not. I mean, part of the reason we've been backcountry skiing and not alpine skiing on the mountain is that it's free to backcountry ski, with the exception of paying for Abbey education and things like that. I'm a college student. I didn't make very much money during my ski career. We can talk about this if you want. Brown is paying for my education, which is amazing. But I don't have a lot of money to go buy lift tickets. So we backcountry ski. And during COVID, my partner and I lived in Southern Oregon. I took classes remotely for the year when Brown was offering remote classes, and she was working at the Planned Parenthood clinic there, and we were skiing on volcanoes all over in Northern California and Southern Oregon. So that's mostly where we've been skiing.
No wonder I didn't hear from you in like a year. That sounds amazing. That sounds incredible. That's really great, Noah. Ben, do you want to switch us over to talking about doping, or do you have any more backcountry questions?
No. So I actually wanted to finish my backcountry question, which is, when should we assume that you're an example of a larger pattern, that the people who are cross-country ski racing are kind of recreationally backcountry skiing, or are they kind of two separate cultures that you're bridging?
There's a huge amount of crossover, and it's geography specific. So in places like Aspen and the Pacific Northwest, so anywhere up in Colorado, Pacific Northwest, there's a huge amount of crossover between these communities. In places like the upper Midwest and New England, where there's a huge cross-country ski scene, there's not a very big backcountry skiing because there's not mountains, or there's really shitty snow like in the Northeast.
Yeah.
All right. So I want to tell you my performance-enhancing drug psychodrama, which is that I grew up as a fanatic baseball fan, and then in the early aughts, when all these great baseball records fell to people who were obviously doping, I stopped being able to watch baseball and have never watched baseball again. And I switched to what I thought was the sport that was, they were clearly trying to do something about it, which was cycling, which isn't as crazy as it sounds. They were testing everybody every race. There was, there was a serious effort going on. And besides, there was this legendary figure going for, 7 tours in a row. It was really exciting. And when Lance turned out to be a charlatan, I just stopped being able to watch sports, period. And my view now is, if I don't know the person, or at least one person competing personally, it's strangers competing over who has the best doctors. And so and I literally, other than occasionally socially being somewhere where people are watching sports, I just don't do it anymore. And I'm interested in your sense of it as somebody who's been in the who's been in the community, who's been how wrong am I? Like, just to assume that the incentive structure is so pro-doping that there's no reason for a person on the outside to look at any athlete and assume that they're clean.
I think you're quite wrong. And I think that for a little bit of context, right? This is kind of I pivoted hard to this when I retired from skiing. So I do contract work with the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency, educating athletes about their rights and responsibilities under the World Anti-Doping Code, about what it's like to get tested, about what they have to do. I am a member of a new athlete advocacy group called Global Athlete, and our entire mission is to pressure the International Olympic Committee and the World Anti-Doping Agency to be better at their jobs, to serve athletes better, to serve the broader public better. And the biggest issue facing world sport from a doping perspective right now is not individual athletes like Lance Armstrong. The testing has actually gotten so sensitive in the last decade that we're now catching individual athletes who are taking substances completely unintentionally, through food products, through supplements. We saw this at track and field this summer. Then there was the marijuana issue, but there was also the pork.
Wasn't it like
burrito.
The pork? Yeah.
So I think, Ben, that countries that are not instigating institutional doping, that the majority of their athletes are clean. But the elephant in the room is right in line with all of the work that you do, Ben, at Lawfare, which is this is a geopolitical
state issue.
It's a state issue now, and it's a state issue. It continues to be a state issue with Russia. There is discussion about a lot of other authoritarian, powerful countries that are instituting similar type schemes to what happened in Russia. There's no reason to believe that.
Just to explain it for people, like it's propaganda, right? Like having successful world-class athletes is like a propaganda.
Russia invaded Crimea 3 days after the conclusion of the Sochi Games, after the 50K that I was in when they swept the podium, thanks to drugs. All three of those athletes were wrapped up in the state-sponsored doping scheme in Russia. I was in the lead pack for 49K, and they skied away from the final group, swept the podium. The award ceremony for that for that race was at the closing ceremony. They wait and present medals at the closing ceremony. You've got 3 Russian men on the podium. You've got Putin there in attendance. You've got an incredible amount of national pride. You've got an incredible amount of international attention. And then you invade Crimea 3 days later. And those things are not disconnected.
So this is an area where,
well said.
It is an area where propaganda and, frankly, covert action come together in a remarkable way. If you have not, I'm sure you have, Noah, for those of you who have not watched the movie Icarus, which is about exactly this at Sochi, do. It is really, at the time the movie came out, I wrote in Lawfare that this is actually the best movie about Russian interference in the U.S. elections that's ever been made, because it's not about it at all. It's about some other process to corrupt using covert actions and means. There are a series of conversations that I had with the filmmaker, Brian, on the Lawfare podcast that are, worth listening to in light of what Noah is saying. Noah's describing the athlete side of it, but this really was a geopolitical statement being made that had, for which they were using the instrumentalities of covert action. And they created, holes in walls to pass samples, fake. It was a remarkably sophisticated set of operations.
Yeah, I'll elaborate a little bit. And I can elaborate as much as you want. I had the opportunity to interview I host the Global Athlete podcast, and I had the opportunity to interview Dr. Grigory Rajchenkov this summer, who was the mastermind behind the entire thing. He's the subject of Icarus, and he
amazingly still alive.
And amazingly still alive. There's a whole bunch of things about that. So we worked really hard from 2019 to 2020 to pass the Rajchenkov Anti-Doping Act, which was signed into law reluctantly by President Trump after passing both houses of Congress unanimously last December. We're coming up on the 1-year anniversary of that. That was in response to the fact that the things that Rajchenkov was reporting on were not criminal acts in the US, and therefore he was not eligible for witness protection. His witness protection has been entirely privately funded because of that kind of loophole. So the Rajchenkov Act fills that loophole. It brings the power of federal law enforcement to the fight for clean sport. Importantly, it does not criminalize doping for athletes specifically. That was done both to bring people along because would have been huge resistance to criminalizing doping for athletes, but it was also done because, as I was saying to my initial answer to your question, Ben, the current anti-doping system actually does a pretty decent job of catching individual athletes. The problem is these state-sponsored international schemes, and this is what the Rajchenkov Act is focused on. It criminalizes any doctor, coach, administrator, government official who facilitates international doping. It does not criminalize it for athletes. So that was part of this process. And
so question, we're going to have a Winter Olympics in China, and everybody says, we should be boycotting because of Peng Shuai or some political statement. But why isn't China in exactly the same position other than having a much less elite athlete corps in the Winter Olympics than Russia does? But leaving that aside, there seemed to be in exactly the same position that Russia was in vis-a-vis Sochi, which is you control the environment, you can get away with all kinds of stuff. Why should anybody have confidence in any Chinese athlete's performance in this coming Winter Olympics?
I don't have an answer to that.
No.
But that's a really interesting distinction that you're making. Because your answer to my original question, which is, should I watch sports and have confidence in that any given athlete is clean, is you couldn't be more wrong. But the individual, that's what your answer is at the individual level. But at the state level, your answer is there's no reason to have confidence in any Chinese athlete's performance in a couple months in Beijing. That's a really remarkable statement.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so one thing I want to highlight what I think is the most interesting thing that Dr. Rajchenkov told me in August when we talked, which was that the crucial element to being able to pull off what Russia did in Sochi was having their own laboratory, their own WADA accredited laboratory. Now, there's actually not that many WADA accredited laboratories in the world, but there is one in Moscow and there is one in Beijing. And it is, I think that any country that has their own WADA accredited laboratory and an authoritarian state with the type of incentive structure that Russia and China have is not going to be effectively disincentivized from doping in the international system.
I want to talk for a second. I know that like everything you're saying has like huge impacts on like kind of geopolitics and kind of a lot of the stuff that Ben writes about and a lot of the stuff that you've referenced. But I kind of also, just because I'm your friend and have known you for a while, want to talk about kind of the impact that this had on you personally as like an athlete who didn't dope and kind of what you've gone through emotionally and psychologically. You've always been like so adamant about this. And I remember, you're going to have to forgive me, I forget his name, but I do remember that there was like one person in particular that had been on your team and got caught doping, and you like went out on a limb and were like, no way, he didn't do it. And then it kind of had flipped. And I know that was hard for you. I mean, like, do you have kind of like, I mean, Ben has one level of cynicism. Like, I never think of you as a cynical person, Noah. Like, you're a really earnest, hardworking person. I feel like you always believe in kind of like the goodness of people and like that they're going to come through and that most people don't do the wrong thing. And in fact, it's really interesting to me that you draw this distinction between individual and state, because I think that that's like in keeping with that. But like, what does it feel like as an individual, like to kind of like have worked really hard and to have been at 49K in that race and then like have gone through that?
Yeah, so the frustrating thing was that those three Russian athletes, among with a couple of others, finished ahead of me on the world ranking list that season, the 2013-14 season. And I finished 31st on the world ranking list that season, and top 30 qualify for the U.S. ski team's A team. And the U.S. ski team's A team receives approximately $25,000 worth of funding that the B team does not. And I was named to the B team because I was 31st and not top 30. And all of those Russian athletes were ahead of me, and I never got that funding. And when the doping was revealed a couple years later by Dr. Rajchenkov and by the Stepanovs, who blew the whistle before Dr. Rajchenkov did, it was too late for me to get, and it's not just me, right? This is happening all over the world, where like these ranking lists that aren't really part of the results you see on a day-to-day basis, they matter. They matter for team selection. They matter for start lists. They matter for funding.
Do people talk about their methodologies for those ranking lists, by the way? Or is it like, just like, no, not really? Or doesn't it matter?
No, I think like the US ski team is relatively transparent about why they select that and what they do.
Sorry, that was one of the questioners coming in. It has
Great.
to do this weird thing. Sorry, I didn't mean to distract you.
No problem. So that was one area I was affected. Another one was this athlete. His name is Johannes Dwyer from Austria. Was a good friend of mine. He finished one of the best races of my career was at the Tour de Ski in 2014 in January. It was a point-to-point race from Cortina, Italy to Toblach, Italy. I mean, it was, everything came together for me. It was one of those days that you dream about as an athlete that I just, I couldn't make myself hurt. It was like all of my training coming together, and I couldn't believe that anybody had possibly skied faster than me. Well, Johannes was the only athlete that skied faster than me, and he skied a minute faster than me in a race that was under 2 hours. I mean, he just destroyed me.
Wow.
A month and a half later, I was actually eating breakfast with him the morning before the 50K in Sochi, that same race I've been talking about. We were chatting. I went out. I said goodbye. We were chatting about his son, whose name is Noah, kind of coincidentally. His like 6-month-old son. We went out and did training. I didn't see him again. I came back from training, checked out my phone, and the headline was, Austrian athlete Johannes Dwyer test positive for EPO, sent home from the Olympics. All of his results are nullified. He'd been taking EPO all year long. It was, so I had, the answer was that actually in that best race of my career, I was the best in the world, but I didn't get to experience that on the day.
Or, I mean, like even that much after, like, I mean, at that point, there's other races that have been taken. I mean, it's like a tragedy. I mean, I don't even know who holds the Tour de France since they've stripped it from like, no one knows. Like, this is the whole thing.
And if there's an athlete in there that did it clean, that was 7th or whatever it is, and all 6 people ahead of them, I mean, who cares that they're getting awarded the title now? Nobody. The sponsors don't care. The public doesn't care. So the last thing I'll mention is what you were talking about, Kate, which is one of my really good friends, Karl Tomjar from Estonia.
Oh yeah, it was Karl.
We have a very big pro-Estonian contingent on this show.
Okay.
Well, mostly the former president of Estonia comes on the show. Is like a big fan of the show. Anyways, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I'm sure that this news story broke in 2019 during the Estonian presidential election, and it actually eclipsed kind of the presidential politics for a little while. It was so big in Estonia. So Karl was one of. He's like come over to the States and adventured with me in the desert, gone canyoneering and mountain biking and climbing with me. Really close friend. He actually so I had retired in 2018. I was at first year at Brown, and he had booked flights over for the spring of 2019 after the season. And I came out of my math class at Brown, my Algebra 1 class or Calc 1 class, and my phone is just blowing up. One of the first text I saw was, "Your friend Carl is a fucking C word." I couldn't believe what I was seeing on my phone. He was arrested for doping in Austria, a raid that took down 7 other athletes with a German doctor.
That's so sad. I mean,
and it kind of just ripped me apart. But I think, Ben, this is what I'm talking about, where I'm saying that the system is actually working for these individual athletes. Carl was an individual athlete. He decided to dope on his own. He wasn't. There's a history and a problem with doping in Estonia, but Carl talked. So long story short, I ended up actually telling Carl that I would still go on this adventure with him that spring.
I remember that.
And
I thought that was a good decision, by the way.
I'm really glad that I did in retrospect, and I've kept in touch with Carl a little bit since, and I still consider him a friend. Good people make really bad decisions. But one of the things Carl was talking about was that Estonian skiing was really, really strong in the 2000s when he was coming of age. They had 3 athletes who were all Olympic champions. They were by far the best athletes in Estonia. And here Carl was one of the best athletes, or the best skier in Estonia, potentially in the late 2010s. And his best races are like 30th in the world. And he just felt like that wasn't good enough. And he felt like he had an obligation to try to match this level of Estonian skiing that he had seen when he was young. And that was what drove him to go basically figure out how he could be better and how he could break into that next result. And then he talked about how he was racing some of these races where all of a sudden he'd gone from like 30th on the best day to being top 10. And he was feeling guilty while he was skiing these races and getting these splits and knowing he was skiing this fast. And he was feeling guilty that he was doing it with drugs. It really, having one of my best friends go through that experience, having one of my best friends choose to dope, really humanized the experience for me. But that's why, Ben, I say that the system is working with the individuals. It caught Carl and it caught all these other athletes. But you know what? It has done nothing to stop the state-sponsored doping in Russia.
Such a great
point.
So
that's a really interesting point, but it actually undercuts, I think, your earlier claim in a way that's kind of heartbreaking. So my original question that is, I look at events and I just don't have a lot of confidence that the people that I'm watching are not doping. And, I look at football players who are the size of, Sherman tanks, and I just instinctively do not have confidence that the system. And what you're saying is there's a high probability over time that individual athletes will be caught. But when you're watching a sporting event, that's actually not good enough for exactly the reason that you're describing, which is I don't want to know when I see the medals presented at this race that eventually I'm going to find out who ran the fastest honest race. I want to know who wins, and there's something actually insufficient about knowing that Carl is caught over time. I actually want him not to have won the race that he won.
That's a fair point, and I think what I'm trying to say is that, like, Lance Armstrong getting away with it as an individual athlete for 10 years is no longer possible. But that an athlete, so Johannes got away with it for 9 months. Carl got away with it for about 2 years. But they're not getting away with it for a decade. I agree with you. That's not good enough, but it's at least a step in the right direction.
But it's a hell of an improvement, and it
creates powerful disincentives too. Like, let's just also talk about that. Like, you're not going. I mean, it is something to be humiliated. I mean, literally, Ben and I, we talk about the career. We joke about, we're both journalists. I joke about the career-ending mistake in which I have gotten the quote wrong, or I have like done, and like it keeps me up at night thinking that I would ever do something like that. And like I don't know what I would do if like I had made a decision to like inject something into my veins and like sat there waiting for it to happen for 3 hours while they like kind of did this thing and then like went and did a race. Like I don't know how, it would be a really hard thing to live through. And like, you know, so there is a lot of hopefully there, like over time it creates kind of but you're right, it does make the state sponsored stuff all the more real. And I think Christopher has a question about this. We're going to bring Christopher on. Hold on one second. Hey, Chris.
Hi, wait, which one? I had a couple of questions.
You can just whatever one he hasn't answered yet.
Okay. Yeah, so I actually would like to hear more about this idea that we have tests for like marijuana, like we mentioned earlier, and Sha'Carri Richardson, was banned from the Olympics or disqualified from the Olympics for having a joint after she won a race and had just found out that her biological mother had died, and so it wasn't like, I don't think anyone would argue that marijuana is performance enhancing unless you are using it to dull pain or whatever. But so I'm just wondering whether you think that there's going to be more of it's another one, more of a relaxation or a revising of sort of areas where we have not only false negatives for masking, but for false positives, where it's like the athlete took something or ate the pork or took a joint where they were clearly not trying to performance enhance, but the substance is banned and requires a ban from the games for that.
Yeah, no, I think these are really good questions. So I think this is a kind of a reckoning that the international anti-doping system hasn't done yet. And actually, I think it was interesting, Ben, that you've kind of wrapped in professional sports into our conversation a little bit. But the reality is that the anti-doping systems in professional sports are very different from the anti-doping systems in international Olympic sport because they're collectively bargained. And the athletes have a real say in what those anti-doping rules look like. And that is something that's missing. So to Chris's question, like marijuana in Sha'Carri Richardson's case is prohibited, but there's a real question about like whether it should be or not. That's different from like the pork burrito case where an athlete is so in Sha'Carri's case, she made a mistake, right? But the rules are very clear. That marijuana in your system above a certain threshold in competition results in a ban. She got the shortest possible ban because the anti-doping authorities, everybody believed her story. It was just that ban has to include a nullification of the result where the test was taken, and that was the qualifying race for the Olympics, and so she didn't qualify for the individual race of the Olympics. That was pretty basic. But whether that should be a rule or not, to Chris's point, is something that I personally believe that marijuana should not be prohibited, even though I think there's also an argument to be made, as Chris alluded to, that it actually is performance enhancing in certain sports, in certain situations. Particularly, I dated a slopestyle skier for a long time, and slopestyle skiing is essentially about how much you can suppress your nerves and how much you can risk. You're willing to risk getting hurt in order to perform at the highest level. And in that situation, smoking a little marijuana might be helpful. Now, there are lots of drugs out there that are prohibited in certain sports, but not others. For instance, beta blockers are not prohibited in cross-country skiing. They would be the opposite of helpful, but they are prohibited in shooting sports, including biathlon, which involves.
I was just going to ask that. Like biathlon, that would seem like beta blockers would be like incredible.
Yeah. Well, what about 10-meter pistol shooting, which is an Olympic sport? Of course, beta blocker. So maybe marijuana should be prohibited in certain sports, but certainly it should not be blanketly prohibited. Certainly, I don't think it should be prohibited in 100-meter track sprinting like it was for Sha'Carri. So I would like to see, in that way, a move towards the professional model where athletes have more say in the anti-doping system. And then to Chris's other point about whether athletes or whether we're going to have this reckoning with athletes testing positive accidentally. I think we absolutely need to. And actually, the U.S. Anti-Doping Organization has been really proactive in pushing for higher thresholds on the low end, because the tests have gotten so sensitive. There should be certain positive test results that we just throw out for certain substances. And WADA, in a lot of cases, just says, WADA being the World Anti-Doping Agency, just says, no, any positive test for any amount of these substances result in an automatic suspension of 2 years or 4 years or whatever it is. I think it's time that we take seriously tainted supplements and food products that are getting certain substances that are testing positive for certain substances like pork, etc.
So we have Joel, the nudge, who is I think that Joel, I have felt a bond with you since you started watching the show, mostly because you talked about, you do a lot of cross country skiing and biking, and you do the Berkey. And no one else ever in my life have I met anyone outside of Putney who understands what the Berkey is. But there's,
we're the cool kids. Just saying.
Yeah, you're the cool kids. So, anyways, Joel, go ahead with your question.
So I'm going to try and be quick, Mom and Dad. I swear, I'm going to try to be quick, but I have a lot.
Yeah, you have a lot.
Mr. Hoffman, first, thank you so much for coming and being with us today. I've been watching you ski. Thanks. Skiing Vinny for years, and you've provided such an excellent example for young people in this country. And I cannot tell you the value of that. I've been a Nordic coach now for 10 years, and I am the coaching director for the high school mountain bike league in the state of Minnesota. And one of the things that we talk so much about is coaching to character. I can't make a kid do anything. But if I set a team standard that we will be persons of character, character will make you show up to practice. Character will make you try hard when you get there. This issue with substance and cheating and the benefits that it may offer makes it so difficult sometimes to stand by those character and integrity-based arguments. And people like yourself really provide us a lot of help. And I wanted to thank you for that. So I'm pivoting just slightly. How do we help kids understand how to be persons of character and be successful athletes?
It's a great question. Yeah, and thanks, Joel. And I've seen you around in the cross country ski world before. I don't know that you can teach it. What I do want to say is, this kind of goes back for me to something that you said, Ben, at the beginning, which is why, you were talking personally, but why bother with sport at all? And a lot of me, when I left cross country skiing, thought that I was going to just walk away, that I was I want to go work on issues of inequity. I want to go work on issues of poverty. I want to go work on the issues of the climate crisis. I don't know exactly what it is, but I want to do something bigger than cross country skiing. And here I am still talking about international sport. And I think the reason that it's important to me is exactly what Joel said, which is that as athletes, we have an incredible platform, and can actually. I think the work that LeBron has done in getting out the vote in underserved communities, the work that my teammates have done. So Keegan Randall, one of my teammates, Olympic gold medalist with Jessie Diggins in her 5th Olympic Games in Korea, retired the same time I did, right after the Games, was diagnosed with breast cancer 2 months after retiring from cross-country skiing, underwent chemotherapy, lost all of her hair, and was really public and used her platform to just be this incredible inspiration for the survivor community, for people undergoing the same thing. A huge promote. She worked with the organization Active Against Cancer about the benefits of staying active while you're going through chemotherapy. Just incredible, incredible value. Jessie Diggins, who I know Joel is very aware of, who come from the Midwest, has been an incredible role model because she's come forward about her eating disorders and her struggles as an athlete with how to eat healthily with the pressure to perform at the international stage. And the fact that when you stop eating or you don't eat enough, you see a benefit in your performance for a short amount of time. And then, of course, you see the health detriments, and it doesn't work over the long term. But that immediate incentive is so dangerous for especially young women, but also for young men. And this is the value that Jesse has found by being able to formulate, to start these conversations amongst young women in this country. These are the reasons that I stay in sport. And I think that the more that we can, contrary to what the IOC wants to do, where they're trying to silence athletes, that one issue I've fought on a lot is Rule 50 of the Olympic Charter, which prohibits athletes protesting or making any political demonstration on the podium. We've just fought this tooth and nail and have really gotten nowhere with the IOC. But one of the reasons that I believe that athletes should be able to stand up and use their voice is not only because it's an international human right to be able to speak freely, but also because the value of athletics and the value of sport comes from athletes being incredible role models. I think they're, especially as we get into a more polarized world, things like what Keegan and Jesse are doing kind of speaks exactly to what Joel was talking about, which is like the ability of athletes to be role models and to lift other people up and to show young people in this country and old people alike what it's, what pursuing your dreams look like, what it's like to, to overcome obstacles.
You're gonna make me cry now. But I'm serious. Like, I think that that's a wonderful thing. First of all, I would say that like sport helps a lot of people out of a lot of bad situations and gives them a focus, and that there is that exercise, physically doing anything with their body is something that like kind of is a wonderful escape. But it's also kind of like it is humanity, right? Like you are doing like this thing. And yeah, I just think that what you said is exactly right. And the idea that it transforms for you from like, I want to do something other than cross-country skiing to like understanding that sport has this kind of much more profound role is, I don't know. I do think that you're onto something. I think that is absolutely true. And like, the more people that talk about their eating disorders and our Olympic athletes, like, is great for women. Like, it is way better than just like someone yelling at Facebook about having Instagram, like too much Instagram stuff about eating disorders or whatever. It's like a real solution. And so I think that that's a great point. To bring us home, we have Paula, who is a weightlifter and does Olympic weightlifting. And so Paula, I'll let you take it from here.
Yeah. So, my governing body is USAW, obviously, for Olympic weightlifting. And one of the things I've noticed is having a governing body that doesn't tolerate doping really changes who dopes. And I think most people wouldn't know this, but like in USA weightlifting, the people who dope actually suck and are like at the top of it because it's not sanctioned by the governing body. So I was wondering what you think about how not even the state acts, like take away, maybe how USA Olympic Committee might act, but the governing bodies themselves act with their athletes.
I think this is so important. And congrats on your success, Paula. I went to
not even close to the same amount. Not even close. We don't need to compare.
I got to.
I don't know. You guys haven't seen the videos of Paula lifting, and it's kind of fucking awesome. So I just want to say. Anyway.
I don't know if you were competing in Detroit this summer, but I got to be there at the USADA booth and watching all of the athletes. Super, super impressive. I love weightlifting as a sport. And I'm actually, I'm working with the USOPC on their international sport relations, basically strategic plan on how they're going to, what kind of changes they're going to push for internationally. And the chair of this board that I'm on is the president of USA Weightlifting. So that's been really fun to see. So to your point, I think this is so important because the same thing is, Kate, you kind of had a slip of the tongue earlier when you were talking about Carl. You said one of your teammates, and I was like, whoa.
Yeah, I know, I did say that. Sorry, I didn't mean one of your good friends.
Of course, but it's there's a culture also like there is in USA weightlifting and USA cross country skiing in particular, and I think all of US ski and snowboard in general. That's like Paul is talking about, that's just completely intolerant of doping. And that's so important from an institutional level. If I had wanted to dope during my career, I would have had no idea how to do it. I certainly wouldn't have been able to turn to anybody that I normally relied on for advice, because they had absolutely no tolerance for doping or for the idea of doping. And that's the type of institutional norms that you have to develop if you're going to get clean sport. But how you can, and so I'm just basically reiterating what you're saying, Paula, is that's so important, but I have no idea how you take.
I mean, I think you're talking about Phil Andrews, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. I mean, so I'm from the Detroit area. I didn't get to go to that competition, but like, yes, the USADA booth, I've seen that. I was never good enough to, I mean, I got close to getting pulled for like actually having to take a drug test, but I had to take a certification and be inside the random testing pool. And I went with someone as their witness to a drug test. And it's like, they will follow you around the entire competition venue until you go take the drug test. And there's like no questions asked whatsoever. They're very, very serious about it.
So what you're bringing up also is that so not only is it these cultures at USA Weightlifting led by Phil Andrews and at US Ski and Snowboard led by Tiger Shaw, who's actually retiring at the moment, but it's also what Paul is talking about is the US Anti-Doping Agency, which, as I said, I do some contract work for them, but the national anti-doping agencies, which are different in each country, are so important to clean sport. And U.S. anti-doping actually has significant amounts of independence from the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee, which is so important. Yes, a lot of their funding comes from U.S. OPC, but there's safeguards in place to make sure that there's no interference. Also, a substantial portion of their funding comes from the U.S. government, which also helps ensure their independence. And it is led by Travis Tigert, who's been just a kind of a bulldog in the international arena, trying to get a system that works against these international doping systems and that works in the international arena. But it has been very strong. I mean, it took down the Nike Oregon project with some really impressive investigative work. It took down, I mean, Travis led the organization when it took down Lance Armstrong, Ben. And so what Paul is talking about is, yeah, we show up at all these weightlifting events. We show up at all the cross-country ski races. We notify athletes, and we follow the World Anti-Doping Code to a T, and we don't let the athletes out of our sight until they provide their urine sample to us. Even if sometimes I've heard of waits for athletes who are trying to make weight, who are purposely dehydrating themselves, as long as 11 hours to produce 90 milliliters of urine, because these athletes are trying to make weight. But we stick to these rules, and we do the process when we fund it is really important, because we in this country believe in clean sport. And yes, we've had absolutely our fair share of dopers in this country. But I think that role that Paul is talking about of the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency in cleaning up the sport in this country cannot be understated.
No, we have to leave it there. But this was an amazing hour. I've missed you a lot. And Ben, are you muted, Ben? I'm sorry. No, you're not. I just can't hear you. I can't hear you. Can you hear him? Okay. I think your mic's off. There we are.
How about now?
Yeah, that's better.
I was just going to say, Noah Hoffman, you're a great American. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me. It's been so fun.
This was so fun. Please contact me if you want any copies of my old calc tests. From just
luckily, I've pivoted away
from about doping and cheating. That was a joke. Oh my God. But no, seriously, Noah, you're awesome. And I am so happy that you've done so well, Brown. When are you graduating, friend?
I'm graduating in the spring, and I'm looking at law school potentially.
Well, you should talk to Paula, because she's at Michigan Law School right now. And we should talk, and yeah.
And you should, you should be a Lawfare student contributor when you're in law school.
I would love that. That would be very fun.
Yeah. We will be back many hours from now on Monday, December.
We have no idea who the guest is going to be.
No idea who the guest is. No idea what's going on. We'll figure it out when we get there. But we are not allowed to have fun anymore. But in lieu of fun, we are allowed to not take drugs. So don't take drugs and do sport. That's it. That's all I've got. Sorry, guys.